So we're back on Curious Apes, and this time we are joined by Steve Stewart-Williams, who wrote a book that I really enjoy called The Ape That Understood the Universe. And one of the things you do in that book, Steve, that I really love is you start with a almost walkthrough of evolution and what answers your students might give and how you would rank them, starting with what I would say is kind of like the layman's definition to something that's a bit more refined and accurate that you think is a better reflection of what evolution is. Can you kind of give us a little bit of that juxtaposition between what you think people commonly think of with evolution and how you might correct them?
Yeah, I can, no worries. So yeah, it's a six-part process. I think I lay out six hypotheses, and like you say, I started at the bottom of the barrel basically. So I think one of the most popular views about what evolution is about, but also the one that I think is least accurate, and that idea is the idea that natural selection favors traits that are good for the species, and
Mm.
that natural selection, that evolution is just all about what's good for the species. And I pretty quickly rule that one out on the grounds that there are lots of traits that you can see in the natural world that are good for their owners, and they're good for their owners in various different ways, but not good for the species as a whole. My favorite example would be chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are endangered, but a common behavior that was first discovered by Jane Goodall. Actually, she discovered, much to her surprise, that male chimpanzees would periodically band together, and they would go off and beat up or sometimes kill males from neighboring groups, rival groups. And given that they're endangered, that's the last thing they should be doing, right? The last thing they should be doing is going around murdering each other. They do it anyway, though, because it's good for them in some sense. It gets some females, it gets some territories. So yes, that's the first one. I rule that out. The second one is another popular lay view, which is that natural selection is about survival.
Mm.
It favors traits that are good for survival. Clearly, survival is important in selection. If you don't survive, you're not going to pass on your genes. But survival by itself isn't enough. You could survive for 100,000 years. You could survive for 1,000,000 years. If you didn't have any offspring in that time, then as soon as you finally died, then your genes are going to go to the grave with you as well. So option three is maybe it's about reproductive success. So it's about having offspring, and maybe survival is just a means to the end of having offspring. That's a big jump in the right
Mm.
direction. Basically, I say in the book that the first two answers, if you're in my class and you put that in your final essay, you fail. You fail the module. With reproductive success, with having offspring, I think you could probably pass. You wouldn't get a great grade, but you would pass. So reproduction is massively important in evolution. It's not everything though. If you were to have 100 offspring, for instance, but none of them were to survive to have offspring of their own, then you're going to be exactly the same as the person that lives for 100,000 years, but then goes to the grave without having offspring. So basically, you need to, like another step forward, is that you need to have offspring that themselves have offspring, so that you set up a self-perpetuating cycle. So that's a big step. Like I say, a big step in the right direction. It wouldn't get you an A in my module though. To get an A, you'd need to take it a few steps forward, and we come to, and it gets a bit complex here, but we get to what's called the inclusive fitness approach. And the basic idea of that is that you can boost your fitness either by surviving and having offspring yourself, or by helping your genetic relatives to survive and have offspring. And either of those routes can keep any given trait in the population. And then the final one that I put forward is, it's close to that, but it sort of flips your perspective on its head a bit, and says that rather than being about the inclusive fitness of the individual, more properly what we're talking about is the fitness of the genes giving rise to the traits in question. So basically, I come to the gene's eye view, which is that the traits that we see that organisms have are basically designed to pass on the genes giving rise to those traits, and that ultimately it's about genetic fitness.
So
That's how you
would you say
pass.
you subscribe to the selfish gene theory? Would that be a fair kind of interpretation of that idea of
Yep.
gene machines?
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. the gene machine view is basically the selfish gene view. Yeah. Gene's eye view of evolution, it's also known as, yeah.
And what do you say to people who, often hear this idea that we are just trying to propagate our genes into the future, and then they ask the question of why, like people like Steven Pinker would ask, why aren't we just lying outside of the sperm bank?
Yep.
Why do we have birth control? What are some of the things I guess how do we tease apart this notion that we were designed for something, right? But not everything we do is in service of that mission to pass on our genes.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a common question that I get often when I first lay out these kind of ideas when I'm talking to people. They say exactly that. Why do we use birth control? Why do we smoke cigarettes and the like? And I think maybe the best way to get at the answer to that is to draw a distinction between proximate explanations, also known as psychological explanations on the one hand, and ultimate or evolutionary explanations on the other. So the gene machine idea is that the various different traits that we have ultimately were selected because on average they enabled their owners to pass on their genes in the environment in which they evolved. People sometimes mistake that evolutionary explanation, though, for a proximate or a psychological explanation, and they think that the claim is that we therefore must have a motivation, that this is a psychological motivational theory, and we have a motivation to pass on our genes. And like Pinker said, if that were the case, then people would line up outside sperm banks if they were guys, or they would pay other women to have. If they were women, they would pay other women to take their eggs and have their children with their eggs. And we don't do that because we didn't evolve to think about passing on our genes any more than any other animal did. Instead, we just evolved a range of different motivations and drives and desires that on average push us in the direction of passing on our genes. So we evolved, for instance, to want to eat food. You need to eat food just because it keeps you alive. The nutrients in the food give you the energy you need, and they provide the building blocks that our bodies are built out of. But that doesn't mean that when we eat something, it's because we've calculated that by eating, we'll keep ourselves alive for long enough to pass on our genes by reproducing. We don't think that. It's clearer when we think about other animals, I guess. Like we know that like birds eat and they're motivated to eat, but they're obviously not thinking about that, and nor are cockroaches or beagles or pick your species. Any species than us actually clearly isn't going to be doing that. So we don't have a generalized motivation to pass on our genes. That's one part of the answer. And the other part of the answer is we now live in an environment that's very, very different from the one in which we evolved. So we're in the situation of evolutionary mismatch. We live in an environment where, for instance, we had birth control, whereas we never had that throughout the course of our evolutionary history. And we live in an environment with cigarettes as well, and other kind of things that are harmful to us today. And people initially think, well, isn't that contrary to an evolutionary point of view? It's contrary to an evolutionary psychological perspective. But I think actually when you think about it more closely, it makes perfect sense in terms of an evolutionary psychological perspective, because it provides a very good explanation for why we use birth control and why we smoke cigarettes and do other stuff like that, even though it's bad for our fitness. And the reason is that we didn't evolve in an environment that had those things in them, so we therefore haven't evolved any kind of defense against them.
Right. If cigarettes were lurking in the bushes to kill us, we would have evolved a mechanism to not like cigarettes.
Exactly. And we'd be as afraid of them as we are of snakes and spiders and things like that we did encounter throughout most of our evolutionary history.
So I see the coherency here. I'm a big fan of this idea myself, but I feel like one of the things when I try to put these ideas forward to people, one of the things that comes at me very quickly is the picture you painted there feels pretty convenient, and some might say so convenient, in fact, that it might be called a just so story. Things just so happen to work out this way, and it's very easy to look back retroactively and declare that this is why something evolved or why we're doing something now, when we don't really have a good way to falsify that. How do you defend against that criticism? What's your go-to protection against that critique?
Yeah. Against those, yeah. So there's kind of two there, I guess, right? One is the just so story claim. Mm-hmm. One, and the other is the idea that the hypotheses are unfalsifiable, and they're kind of interlinked, but kind of separable. Shall I start? I'll start with the just so story one, I guess. So that is a common criticism of evolutionary explanations for social behavior. I don't think it's a great one at all, rarely, because I guess a just so story. So what is a just so story? I would say that it's an explanation that's given and just sort of accepted without too much evidence. You just sort of look around, make up a story, and it's accepted without evidence. And I'd say two things about that. The first thing is that coming up with explanations isn't unique to evolutionary psychology. Basically, every science does it. It comes up with explanations. They're all just so stories. Another name for just so stories is hypotheses. And it's fine to come up with hypotheses. The only thing that's not fine is if you don't then go and test those hypotheses. And there are many different evolutionary psychology journals, and evolutionary psychology research is published in social psychology journals and all sorts of other journals like that. There's just a ton of effort that's been made over the last 40 or 50 years to test these ideas and not just to put them forward. Now, to be as fair as I can to the critics, I think that initially when that claim came around, it was in the early days of, well, it was called sociobiology then. I would say the same enterprise, but it went under the name of sociobiology, and there was a lot more speculation, at least when it comes to human evolution, a lot more speculation than evidence. And at that time, it was fair enough to say there's not enough evidence. These are just so stories at this stage. I think it's a lot less fair now that there are now hundreds, thousands. There are thousands of studies investigating this. I'd say that to be fair to the critics. The other thing I would say is that I do think that sometimes evolutionary psychologists get overexcited by adaptationist hypotheses. And even though we do try to test them, we sometimes, I'm sure, accept them on not strong enough evidence. So that's that one. And then the other one's unfalsifiable hypotheses. But before I jump into that, is anything you want to add at this point about just so stories?
No. No. I mean, I appreciate that framing of kind of giving some equivocation, I guess, to the criticisms and how it could be leveraged against a lot of other fields. You know, in particular, I think in the philosophy of science in general, we have to admit, almost like in the Einstein way, if you give me a miracle, I'll explain the universe, right? We have always some floating axiom to some extent, right?
Yep, true. And of course, it's not just true, like you say, of evolutionary psychology. It's also true of other kind of explanations for the same phenomena, like sociocultural explanations as well, are in the same boat. And I'm sure that advocates of sociocultural only explanations, I'm sure that they as well sometimes accept their explanations on not quite strong enough evidence as well.
Yeah. I mean, my one thing that drew me to your book was a line that I always tell myself as kind of like an epistemic humility check, is that we're just apes guessing at the cosmos. And you know, I always try to remind myself that, like, even when I think I have a really good answer, a really good explanation, at the end of the day, I have to acknowledge that I'm guessing. Like somewhere at the bottom, there's a guess.
Yep, absolutely. And the best we can do is educated guesses. And at the bottom, where we're taking guess, we are taking an epistemological punt at some point, and just the basic framework of how we understand the universe.
Well, and then with that being said, so how do you then go down to the bottom when you are talking about something that's anachronistic, that exists in a time you can't presently be in, and say, all right, now I'm going to conduct a study on this and falsify? Carefully
and with humility, I guess. Would be the first thing I want to say. And I guess, okay, well, the first thing I got to point out is that I do notice that some people will say that some critics, evolutionary psychological hypotheses, they're unfalsifiable. And then they'll go on to say why they don't think they're true. In other words, they'll go on to try to say, they'll try to falsify them. So they're kind of contradicting themselves. They're just saying they're unfalsifiable, but also I'm now going to falsify them. And also, if anyone's putting forward an explanation for whatever phenomena we're talking about, whether it's the pattern of fears that we have, or sex differences, whatever it is, if they're putting forward a sociocultural only explanation for that, that to do so, that also implicitly says that evolutionary explanation must be false, and that's got nothing to do with that. So they're again saying, if they're saying that evolutionary psychological hypotheses are unfalsifiable, then that means that their sociocultural only hypotheses cannot be proven.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's awkward either way.
Yeah.
But that's a long preamble to say, actually, I think it's quite, the response to the unfalsifiability hypothesis is actually really, really simple. And it's just not true. We have falsified many hypotheses. Actually, I think in the book I put it like this. I say that the hypothesis that evolutionary psychological hypotheses are unfalsifiable is itself a falsifiable hypothesis, and it's been repeatedly falsified. I have plenty of hypotheses of my own that I've been really excited about. I've gone out to try to test them. Nope. And reality says no can do. You're wrong, And I think all or most evolutionary psychologists do. There are plenty of hypotheses that have been falsified. E.R. Wilson's hypothesis about the origins of homosexuality, same-sex sexual orientation. In other words, I consider that that's been thoroughly falsified, and many other ones as well.
I'm going to use that as a jumping point to deep level speculation here. So I hope you'll be willing to go with me. It makes me think of spandrels, right? The idea that as something evolves, something kind of comes along the journey that wasn't the adaptation that was being selected for, basically. With that in mind, do you think like human cognition, have you ever thought about human cognition as a spandrel? Do you think that evolution selected, let's say, qualia, not just cognition, but the experience itself, the feeling that we're the rider? Was that something that came along maybe in your mind, or do you think it was a selected for trait?
That's tricky. Okay, so with the broadest question, like, is cognition a spandrel? I think that it has elements that are just byproducts. I think some of it's not, though. So I think our basic intelligence, I think, was selected, and you can trace it out in the fossil record as our brains got bigger. That went along with our greater cognitive abilities and our cultural abilities. But our cultural ability, I guess, well, both of them actually. So our intelligence and our cultural abilities made us a very open system, and it therefore opened up for us the possibility of acquiring ideas and cultural elements that were not necessarily adaptive, and that were not anything like the kind of cultural elements and ideas that natural selection originally bequeathed our intelligence and cultural capacity for. So then a lot of the stuff that we think about, and a lot of stuff that we do, that I think has, and especially today, after many thousands of years of cultural evolution, has really come off the genetic leash, and is quite a long way away from its origins. And we're really not just a gene machine anymore. We're a sort of hybrid creature. We're a gene machine that also, because of our culture, our acquired culture, is being pulled in other directions as well. And we're like a biocultural animal.
Yeah, can you say more about that? I have here your line is that you near the end of the book you say cultural evolution is key to unraveling the deepest mysteries of the human mind. Pretty strong proclamation there. And you're touching on cultural evolution now. Can you say more about why you feel that that's such a profound question to address if we really want to get to the heart of humanity? I can do so. I think some of the stuff that we most value as a species is largely due to cultural evolution rather than biological evolution. For me, at the top of that list is science and knowledge. And the science and knowledge that we've accumulated is well beyond what you could expect from an upright ape wandering around the place. It's quite amazing, and it's a product of cumulative cultural evolution. Primarily, I mean, we need our basic intelligence. No other animal would be capable of accumulating the kind of knowledge that we have, because they don't have the basic intelligence or cultural capacity to do so. Given that we do have that, though, most of the achievements that we have layered on top of that have come through cumulative cultural evolution rather than the efforts of just one individual or a handful of individuals.
And my favorite example that I like to give is that if you think about Plato and Aristotle, they were some of the greatest thinkers in the history of thinking. They were probably smarter than most people living today, just as they were smarter than most people living 2,300 years ago or whenever it was. But despite that, they had a much less accurate view of the world in many ways than we do today. And in fact, like when my kids, I think even before they went to school, they knew that the Earth is a sphere, and it's a sphere that goes around another big sphere, the sun, and then there's this third sphere, the moon, that's going around it. They had this picture of just the basic setup of the solar system that we live in. And so in that respect, these preschoolers had a more accurate picture of our world in that respect than did the greatest thinkers of the ancient Greek world. And it's not because we're different animals. We're basically the same animal that we've always been for the last several 100,000 years. It's purely because of the slow accretion and build-up of knowledge that we've done step by step, generation by generation. We inherit the knowledge from the earlier generation and tinker with it, and ideally make it possible, make it better and better over time. And it goes backwards sometimes as well. But I think the fact we have the knowledge that we do today is because overall it's gone forward across those thousands of years.
Yeah, one of my favorite pet theories right now, the kind of the work that I'm really interested in, is how evolution falls within a broader kind of, I don't want to say telos because that carries a lot of connotations, but a broader framework. And it would be very centered in like thermodynamics, where you're basically moving towards increasing complexity, trying to dissipate energy through forms that waste more energy and therefore create more entropy. To me, it seems, I guess my theory would be that memetics or cultural evolution is just a better replicator and therefore has kind of taken over from genetic evolution. Do you see any anything in this that you'd be sympathetic to? Do you find the idea that really we're just replicators trying to, I guess, carry on the blueprints of entropy creation as a valid one?
Yeah, it's interesting. So like just sort of locally going against the overall direction of
Because
like the universe. Yeah, the universe is becoming more and more greater and greater entropy, right?
Right.
But just locally,
but we
we're
have
able
the
to.
sun, right? Because we have the
Yeah.
sun, we're not a closed system. We have this infinite
Yeah,
supply of energy. So we're kind of in this heat bath. And the more we can dissipate, the more we can complexify locally, the more we can create global entropy. And it feels like that kind of is driving evolution to me.
yeah, interesting. Do you think there's more complexity today than there was, say, a million years ago, or is it just the matter is arranged in a different way? And among the arrangements, there's a very, very interesting arrangement, which is our culture and our knowledge. But is there actually more complexity in the biosphere than there was? I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say yes. We could argue that, well, there's definitely more entropy creation, I would say, because of things like the Industrial Revolution and the mass of humans who are consuming and almost like in a matrix kind of way, being batteries for for energy creation.
Yeah.
I think the early universe, or the early planet, I should say, was probably very lush and rich with a lot of biodiversity and whatnot. But when I think about our complexity to be organisms or structures or dissipating structures that move into the world and extract energy from it, I think we've definitely complexified in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're probably right. And we are really, really unique among the organisms on the planet and being able to do that, right? And being able to access the energy that's just floating around. It's there for everyone, right? It's there for badgers and beavers as well, but they can't extract the energy out in the way that we have been able to through our culture. Yeah, yeah, it's pretty amazing. Can I jump back to something earlier that you mentioned? So you're talking about
Yeah.
qualia and that kind of thing, and the
Yes.
sense
Yeah.
of us being in control and that kind of thing. And as you're asking that, I was thinking, I'm not. I'm not sure I have a definite answer to that. So I guess with the qualia question, you're getting into the problem of consciousness, right?
Yeah,
Which is a very
absolutely.
tricky one. What are your thoughts on that?
I find it somewhat hard for me to reconcile, I guess, because if I do have this idea that the universe is kind of going through this trajectory, it feels like consciousness in some ways comes in and kind of breaks it. Like not in the sense that memes are problematic. I think memes amplify and actually are like a fantastic solution to continue this path forward. But what it does do, which you alluded to earlier, is it allows us to create an artificial environment that is maladaptive, and it starts to basically undermine its own progress. Like if we destroyed ourselves because we're so maladapted to our environment, we would destroy the blueprints that are trying to be carried into the future to increase complexity. Like we could wipe out all the complexity on the planet by
Yep.
being maladapted.
Yep, and I do think we could, and I think near that passage that you at the end of the book that you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
I talk about the fact that more and more we are getting into the driver's seat of the planet as a whole, for better or for worse, or I mean probably for both, right? But I think potentially we could wipe ourselves out with the knowledge that we have, or not. You know, we might. I think um, I'm really uncertain where we're going to go in the future, and whether we're going to wipe ourselves out or not, or whether we're going to uh, carry on and make things better.
Yeah. Do you, I mean, this is a subject that for me is like a daily meditation and challenge for my optimism. I am concerned that when I look at how I don't want to get into the free will conversation because that's a whole nother one. But in my mind, there's a very obvious relationship between the needs of an organism and the behavior that it undergoes. And it feels like if your needs aren't being met, certain parts of your brain will take over that push you towards certain behaviors. It feels like we're in a vicious feedback loop right now because of maladaptation, because we are
Mm,
surrounded by so many things that we did not evolve for, whether that's social media, sugar in abundance, information in abundance,
yep.
that we're continually thrashing like a fish out of water. It's just like we're pulling ourselves more and more out of water. And in our thrashing to get back, we're doing really destructive behavior for ourselves and our planet. And I'm having a hard time wondering how we get back. So I guess, I don't know, do you see that through the evolutionary lens?
Yeah, I do, and I know exactly what you mean, and I do feel like sometimes it seems like we're just, as a species, just driving ourselves crazy
Yeah.
with social media and that kind of thing. And it is, I don't know. I guess I tend to be like if I had to make a bet toward things are going to be okay versus they're not, I would tend to bet on the side of optimism. But I think my bet, I would feel less confident making that bet for optimism today than I would have, I don't know, 5 years or 10 years ago. Um, but I don't know. To look at the other side though as well, like in a lot of ways, I do buy the arguments of the rational optimists like
Mm-hmm.
Steven Pinker and Matt Ridley and the like, that in many ways the world is vastly better than it used to be. The main example that jumps out at me always is the fact that until very recently, infant mortality was much, much higher than it is in the developed world today, and most of the world, in fact. And that it wasn't at all uncommon for like 50% of kids that were born to not make it to adulthood, or even to the age of 5. Most of them didn't make it. Most of that 50% was before they were 5 years of age, which is obviously horrendous for them. They were born and then had a horrible, painful death before even being able to have a life. They didn't have the life that potentially they could have had. But also just imagine the vast misery that must have caused to the parents and other family members and loved ones of that kid. And for all the problems that we have today, the fact that that is so much less common is just represents a huge decrease in the amount of human misery, I would
Right.
say, that has come along.
I see that as a path forward, but I also like let's take an example, one specific one that I think about. So when I think about cultural evolution, I think of let's say the frequency bias or
Yep.
prestige bias or success bias. And then I do something like put that in the framework of social media. Easy
Yep.
target, but it's a relevant one. Um, if I'm an up and coming monkey and I look at other monkeys around me and I say, what do monkeys love? What can I do to
Yep.
be loved as a social ape? Right now, it feels like the best thing to do is become really rich, famous, and sell advertising. like,
Yep.
like, or be Donald Trump, or
Yep.
the politics aside, I don't think that's somebody that we'd want to embody as the hero for our hierarchy.
Yep.
Um, and yet the incentive structures of the culture that we have built, the environment that our animal is evolving in is social media. And to me, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because you would say that we're using that prestige bias to look into things like social media, right? That would be an appropriate thing to say, probably.
Yeah. So I definitely think that prestige bias and success bias and conformity bias, all these kind of learning biases that we have, these social learning biases, I do think that they're quite a deep-seated part of human nature. And I do think that being part of human nature, I'm suggesting that they must have evolved. There must be adaptations. So that means that in the past, they must, at least on average, they must have been useful. It must have
Mm-hmm.
been useful in the past, at least, to copy the most prestigious, high-status individuals in one's group. I guess the adaptive rationale for that would be that the individuals that are most successful in your group, presumably part of that is due to some of the learning that they've done and the memes that they picked up, and the way that they live and the like. And so if you copy them, then you potentially you're going to acquire those useful ways of life and memes as well. And likewise, people who are successful, high status. You see it even in chimps, actually. So chimps will more often mimic high status chimps than lower status chimps. So it's certainly something that can evolve. Conformity bias as well. There's a good adaptationist rationale for why, at least in the past, it might have been very useful, at least on average, again, to copy the most common ideas that are
Yeah.
around the place. Just the fact that they've survived means that they have, to some extent, stood the test of time. But in the past, right, and we're in a very different environment now. Just the fact that things are changing so quickly for a start means that conformity is maybe going to often get us stuck with memes that were useful in the past but are no longer as useful anymore. And then, like you say, particularly with social media, I think that a tendency to copy the higher status individuals is going to definitely misfire often, I think, in the context of social media. And to copy celebrities and I don't know, it can always go. Even pre-social media, I can think of why that would sometimes go wrong, right? So like a lot of the high status figures, especially for young people, might be like rock stars and movie stars and sports stars and the like. And I don't know, especially like with rock stars, I think people would often copy not just the things that made the rock star famous and successful, but also just stuff that came along for the ride. So I
Yeah.
guess like a cultural equivalent of a spandrel. Things like the rock star's drug habit and crazy lifestyle and things like that. So maybe it's just social media. What it does is just sort of accelerate that process and just give us just a massive flood of role models, many of whom certainly are just the loudest voices that have crowded out the rest, and therefore not maybe the ideal role
Yeah.
models. But at the same time, let me just try to think: is there a positive side to all this as well? And I think even though maybe they're harder to find, there are role models that are quite positive these days as well. Like we do have lots of options, and it's not the case that the only options are just be like Donald Trump or be like the loudest person on Twitter or X or whatever it is.
Right.
We also have people who are doing amazing and evolutionarily unprecedented stuff, like the work that's done with effective altruism and trying to combat existential risks and just that people talking about these kind of issues and talking about the kind of problems that we have. We have the culture going haywire on the one hand, but there is also a big part of culture which is getting things right. And
Right.
it's not as loud, but it is there, I think.
This brings to mind some of Robert Sapolsky's work in
Mm.
Africa, and he did the work with, I believe, with the baboons, where there was a resort that was opened up. The, let's say, the upper ranking members of the baboon troop ate tainted meat that had bovine tuberculosis, died off. The females of the group took over, and the lower ranking males, and it seemed like the shift occurred in that group where more reciprocal and altruistic behavior was rewarded rather than more aggressive and dominant behavior. And I believe that even testosterone, because of the challenge hypothesis, showed that testosterone, rather than making males aggressive, would actually make them more kind because the culture gave them status for kindness. Do you
Yeah.
agree with this notion of biology kind of in the service of culture in a sense? And maybe that is one way we can navigate the situation we're finding ourselves in?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, that the Sapolsky findings are very interesting, right? And I think also what he claimed on top of that was that not only did it shift the culture of that baboon troop, but that persisted for
Mm-hmm.
like once it was in place, that new culture
Even
persisted,
with
which is
new
yeah,
additions to the group, yeah.
exactly. They were enculturated to this new kind of culture. I reckon that's fascinating, and I hope he's right about it. I am sort of mindful of the fact that I haven't heard anything else like it about baboons or other such species. So you'd think that if they were quite so flexible, I just imagine there'd be more variation among baboons. But
Right.
actually, that's when we're talking about us, though. I think that's neither here nor there, because I think we really are that flexible, and we really can create kinder cultures and less kind cultures and everything in between, and have done so right throughout the course of history. And the same people who are Vikings only a few centuries ago are now among the most peaceful people on the planet. So we have whatever baboons can do, and however flexible they might be, we are massively flexible. And I do think that it's all down to culture. And I think culture can certainly find ways to sublimate some of our worst inclinations, and actually even just dull them down. So there's Steven Pinker has made the case, and I think he's basically right that the levels of aggression have come down pretty steadily
Yeah.
over the course of the last 100 years and 1,000 years and 10,000 years. Some ups and downs. Maybe levels of violence went up a little bit when we first moved to agriculture, but overall today, I think in most nations they are lower. So, and I think it's not just that we have that we feel like aggressing just as much, but have ways to not do it, and we worry about law and that kind of thing. I think actually that we feel like doing it less as well because of the way that culture has shaped us.
Yeah. Do
So
you
yeah.
consider yourselves a more of a Hobbesian or a Rousseauian?
I would say that I guess I'm more of a Hobbesian, but I'm reluctant to choose either way
A
because I
great
think
a
that there are
great
from
option is
yeah
equally valid if you'd like to
yeah
take
yeah
that
yeah yeah
route.
exactly. But I think probably if I had to choose one or the other, that I would choose Hobbes, because I think that rather than civilization corrupting us, like when we're being selfish or aggressive or that kind of thing, I think that rather than civilization corrupting us, that we are just sort of like those things do come naturally to us. I mean, niceness comes naturally to us as well, but I do think that like if we look at the downturn in aggression and
Yeah.
the increase in our concern for non-human animals and for people that we've never met on the other side of the world, I do think that has been fostered
Hmm.
by civilization rather than that being our natural default state. Uh, yeah, our default state with civilization corrupting us.
So in terms of out groups, I think I agree with you, but I'm going to push back on you a little bit, I think, on in
Great.
groups. Um, I have a feeling, or I guess my intuition is that while we have probably 600 roughly million years of evolution where we were probably more inclined towards selfish behaviors, that would be maybe more aggressive. The 55 or 65 million or so years that we came from fission fusion primates into the social primates that we are today, it seems to me that the social evolution kind of took that selfish desire and said, if you want to get to the top of the hierarchy, if you want to be in the group, the best thing to do is to be pro-social. We will reward you for excellence in the group. And while, of course, that's a 600 million year to 60 million year difference, it does feel like that the previous 60 have really kind of reined in, honed, and maybe channeled those previous, let's say, antisocial tendencies. So do you think there's any validity in that, maybe within the in-group at least, that we do have a very high, let's say, urge or proclivity or inclination to be as good to the group as we can so that we don't get cast out as a free rider or something?
Yeah, interesting, and that's a long-term trend rather than a new one. I do,
Yeah.
and I think this is maybe why I shouldn't have chosen either the Hobbesian or the Rousseauian,
Absolutely.
because I do agree with that. I do think that we a lot of our good traits were given to us by evolution as well, and for many millions of years, and pre-human species. Yeah. I do agree with that. I think you're right that reciprocity, reciprocal altruism is part of that. That we're a groupish animal. That being good to others is something that was selected and is often good. But I'm just trying to think though. While agreeing with all of that, would I agree though that in our modern environment we do less of that? Like are you suggesting that maybe in our modern environment we're doing less of that, or just that it's always been the same?
I would say post Dunbar, the evolutionary checks and balances that made the group adherence matter have broken largely. I think that the dark tetrad types get more capacity to kind of be free riders and exploit, well, especially other groups, but even their own group to an extent, right? I would exploit another American maybe because they're not actually in my in group, even though they're, kind of in my group. And so with that, yeah, I think I don't know how you feel about Dunbar, the idea that, we cognitively can only be in about groups of 150 people and track that many relationships, but it does seem post Dunbar, when we got larger scale societies, maybe those checks and balances that made us care about how the group felt about us, those started to fall apart a little bit. I don't know if we evolved out of that, but it's an evolutionary mismatch at the least.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that, so I do think that those checks and balances, just because it's a bigger society, those checks and balances don't exist innately anyway. They're not part of human nature. Any kind of way to modulate that is part of human nature. And I also agree that the psychopaths and dark tetrad types of the world have more scope to apply their trade in the modern mass societies that we live in. So they can do more damage. They are a minority though, and I do think though that culturally we have created various ways to solve the problem, the post-Dunbar problem. Historically, we've had religions, for instance. I think one of the functions of religion has been to enable larger societies to cohere. Moral systems as well. Today we still have moral systems. Some people still have the religion doing that work, but we do have moral systems that are sort of pushing us in the direction, dark tetrad types notwithstanding, but pushing us in the direction to be decent to other people as well. And maybe the fact that levels of aggression are going down, it's just a good barometer of a more general trend that actually we are treating people beyond that Dunbar level better in general. And yeah, if you see what I mean,
Yeah,
just treating that as a barometer. Yeah.
I mean, I would hope that maybe that sign of Sapolsky's yet to be replicated efforts. Maybe culture is kind of reigning in the biology in the modern world, like through law and things like that. If we say high status is good behavior, the biology tends to push us towards good behavior.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah. So all of that, the good and the bad is inherent in human nature, I think. And then it's a question of setting up a social structure that brings out the best of us and tampers down the worst of us to the extent that we can do it.
Yeah. I do find it interesting that more work with Sapolsky, that with that kind of idea hasn't been replicated, because it feels very, my intuitions gravitate towards it very heavily. Like it feels, if we do, I mean, you would say memetics, the memetic realm, the symbolic realm, the cultural realm. This is part of our environment, right? Like
Yep.
you would put that in the evolutionary landscape, and it seems that we have to respond to that.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. My intuition as well is that Sapolsky's quite possibly right.
Yeah, and maybe it's just more rare, at least in that domain, because you typically don't get to find a group of baboons who had all of their alphas conveniently die from one unique exposure
Yeah.
to a resort.
Yeah.
And then human level studies would be unethical.
Yeah. Exactly. And to killing off the the high
Right.
status the mean males. Yeah.
What do you think about the notion of I think it was Cochrane and
Harpending.
Harping, yeah, their kind of notion of evolution speeding up in the last 10,000 years.
Yeah.
Can you say anything about that and your thoughts?
Yeah, I can. It's an interesting idea, and so the traditional view was that once culture came along, it shielded us from many of the old selective pressures that we used to have. Famine, weather, environmental problems, disease, predators, etc. Shielded us from that, and then the traditional idea was that kind of meant that human evolution just drew to a stop. Their idea, though, is that actually once we had more people, especially after the agricultural revolution, and there were more people, therefore more variants, that culture became one of the main selection pressures acting on us. And there are some pretty plausible ideas about things that could have evolved in response to them. The best known one, and I think the best documented one, is about lactose
Mm,
tolerance. So in human groups where they started the cultural habit of drinking the milk of non-human animals, of cows or goats or camels or whatever, they started herding them and then started helping themselves to some of that milk, which initially must have been a really odd thing to do. And it's very hard to get your head around how people might have started doing that. Somehow they did, though. Once they did, they had this new source of protein that they could lay their hands on. The problem, though, is that they couldn't access most of the nutrients from a lot of the nutrients from it. Maybe 50, 60% or thereabouts only they could digest. And that's because when we're born and before we're weaned, we, human beings, most mammals, we have an enzyme called lactase that helps us break down the lactose in the milk so that we can digest it. But for the vast majority of mammals and also most humans, post-weaning, that we stop making that enzyme. Is just Darwinian cost cutting. There's no point making it if you're not going to be using it. Suddenly there was a reason to use it, though, once we were drinking the milk of non-human mammals. And so that created a selection pressure for the ability to digest lactose all the way through the lifespan. And that very quickly, in the strange way that evolutionists use that term. So over thousands of years rather than
yeah.
tens or hundreds of thousands of years, very quickly evolved the capacity to digest lactose in those groups that were doing that. And that's an example of recent rapid evolution. And most interesting, it's an example of a biological response and
Mm,
biological evolution in response to a cultural innovation.
absolutely. Would I be correct in saying that many of the recent evolutionary changes, though, let's say in the last 10,000 years or so, have been largely restricted to things like digestion, immune system, and let's say phenotypical stuff, but also maybe like blood oxygenation, things like this, but nothing really cognitive. Like, are
Yes.
there any cognitive like evolutionary psychology changes that you could point to?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's really simple physiological stuff that involve
Mm,
just a substitution of one or a few alleles for other ones.
right.
And I think it's not cognitive. I think that cognitively we're just all the same species, right? It's certainly not the case. That there are some populations, for instance, that have an emotion
Mm,
that no other group
right.
has, or they don't have an emotion that other groups do have, or a cognitive ability. We all have language ability and the capacity of a culture and the like.
Right.
So it's just simple kind of stuff like that. So
How
there are certainly
far?
limits to. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, no, no. How far back would you take that? I think Yuval Harari points to 60,000 years ago or so, the idea of the cultural revolution, or the cognitive, I'm sorry, the revolution, wherein something seemed to happen with the emergence of art and pottery and tools, where there was a cognitive shift that might have happened. I don't
Yeah.
know your thoughts on that. I'd love to hear them, but how far back would you say this version of human goes back?
My guess is it goes a lot further back than
Mm,
60,000 years. I would say hundreds of thousands of years is my best guess. In terms of the, if you like, to put it simplistically, the innate hardware. And I think what happened 60 or 70 or whatever thousand years ago was culture starting to take off rather
mm.
than a cognitive change. So I think it's much deeper within our lineage.
So you don't see a hardware change that occurred then. It was more like there was just enough. We kind of hit the hockey stick on the curve
Yeah,
of cultural evolution.
exactly. Like a prehistoric singularity.
Mm,
That's my
yeah.
best guess. Yeah.
And does it seem looking forward like? I mean, it's a bit tongue in cheek, but I often say now to people, I feel like biological evolution is dead. To me, it's obviously still functioning, but the speed at which we're going to change our environment is just so drastically fast compared to what the body could keep up with, that to me it seems like culture is driving the ship now.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think you're right. And these examples of recent evolution, as well as being very simple physiological things, they're also examples where the cultural innovation in question was around for a long time. So
Mm,
a long time now in human terms rather than in evolutionary terms. So hundreds and several thousands of years of milk drinking, for instance. Whereas the kind of cultural change we're seeing today is vastly too rapid to be having any effect, I would say, on our biological nature. And you know, before it can even start to change our biological nature, culture is going to have changed again in certain
right.
ways. And so, you know, in that respect, I don't think that it could be having a biological impact directly. So in that sense, I do agree that culture is rarely steering the ship. I guess that the only thing I would add, well, maybe a couple of things. One is that the direction that we're staring at is still very, very importantly impacted by
Mm,
the nature of human nature.
yes.
So I think that biological evolution is still relevant in that sense. And I would also say, and I think you said this earlier actually, is that biological evolution is still happening. There are allelic substitutions. The frequency of different genes is changing. One example I've been looking at recently is the idea of what's it called? A mutation selection balance in terms of maintaining alleles that increase the chances of schizophrenia. So one of the
Mm,
explanations for schizophrenia is largely genetic. Um, there's a question like why do the genes stick around in the population though, given that it's quite a debilitating disorder. And the reason is that new mutations are coming in at a sort of faster rate than they could be selected out. And it just sort of hits a balance where they maintain a frequency, a certain kind of frequency where schizophrenia is rare but never quite disappears. And things like
mm.
that, you can only really understand that if you look at the fact that selection is still taking place and evolution is still taking place in our species.
Yeah, speaking of things that you're looking at right now, I mean, I know I'm probably gonna want to let you get to the rest of your life here soon, but I want to also hear what do you think about the current circumstances? Where are you thinking a lot about? Like, are there certain evolutionary mismatches that you're finding yourself particularly sensitive to right now, that are particularly salient, or problems that you are finding yourself very curious to explore these days? Can you just say a little bit about where your
Yeah,
mind's at?
um, I can do. And I think this is probably not the kind of angle you might be thinking I was going to take, but the
Go
main
for
thing
it.
I'm working on, so I'm working on a third book at the moment, and it's going to be about sex, the nature and nurture of sex differences, basically. And I do think that's one area where we seem to, I don't know, there seems to be so much of a dislike of the idea that sex differences have anything to do with nature. people are quite happy to say, of course, it is nature and nurture. And of course, I'm not saying that it's nurture, but then people often do, then having said that, just focus on the nurture side and really, really dislike the idea that certain sex differences may have an evolutionary basis. So I guess that is probably the main thing that is on my mind at the moment. And I do think that having an accurate picture of the nature of sex differences and the magnitude of sex differences, I do think it's quite important, just in the sense that getting it wrong can create problems for us. And I think getting it wrong in both directions can create problems. So I think maybe historically what we tended to do was massively exaggerate the scale of sex differences. We thought, okay, men are like this and women are like that, and so we're going to make sure men can only do these roles and women can only do these roles, even though most sex differences are relatively modest in our species. So that's what we used to do, and I'm sure people still do it to some degree, exaggerate them, stigmatize people who break the exaggerated stereotype version of the nature of the sex differences. But I think there are also problems in doing the opposite, which more often happens these days. There are problems associated with minimizing sex differences or denying sex differences, most obviously in terms of health. So there's been, until relatively recently, a tendency to look at the effects of drugs on one sex only, and often it's guys who volunteer to do that. So we know a lot about how they affect men, much less about how they're going to affect women, which is potentially a problem. Like often it's not a problem. Often it's fine for both sexes, and the same doses work about as well. But there are cases where that's not the case, and where actually something that is fine for men is not so fine at all for women, or that the dose needs to be different. And that hasn't really been on people's radars because it's just an idea that sex isn't hugely important, and we can just do the research on either sex and that will give us knowledge for both sexes. It's often true, but it's not always true, and it can create problems if we ignore it.
Yeah, given that caveat that the overlap between the sexes is drastic.
Yep.
What can we point at some of the differences? Are there differences that really stand out to you that either you think people don't often address, or that are just ones that you think are really pertinent to things like medical care or how we behave in the world?
Yeah, there are a few. In terms of medical care, one of the big ones is that women's immune systems tend to be, it's like if you have a volume controller on people's immune systems, the average level is higher for women than for men. And that means, for instance, when they have vaccines, that women on average respond more strongly to them. And sometimes that can be like problematically so. The degree of the response can be problematically strong. More often that's the case in women than in men. In terms of psychological sex differences, I went on a podcast last week and I asked the host, can you guess what is the single largest psychological sex difference in our species?
I would go with neuroticism.
Neuroticism is actually quite modest. The neuroticism difference, yeah. I think small to medium typically. It's actually sexual orientation. So most men are primarily attracted to women. Most women are primarily attracted to men. And there's exceptions, of course, but that is actually quite a large sex difference, much larger than the vast majority of the ones that we actually talk about. We tend not to think about that one, though, I've noticed. So when people are talking about and thinking about sex differences, like I've read papers that say, here are the main candidates for evolved sex differences in our species, and they don't even mention that one. It's like we take it so for granted we don't even notice it.
Wait, can you say the difference again? I mean, it sounded like you said most men are attracted to women, most women are attracted to men.
Yeah.
Is that what you said? But what's the sex difference there? What am I missing?
The target of sexual attraction.
But it's just the inverse, right?
It is the inverse, but and so you could say, okay, there's no sex difference because most people are heterosexual.
Oh, I see what you're saying. That's why it's so easy to overlook. It seems so.
I think so. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But actually, being attracted to men is like a different cluster of traits that you're attracted to than being attracted to women. So it's very different in terms of the primary focus of attraction.
So
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, please, no, go ahead.
Well, going to jump to the neuroticism one. And I'm writing a bit about that in the book. And like the first thing I want to say about that is it's a terrible word, right? Like that word is just
Yeah.
much worse than what it actually means, right? It just means proneness to certain negative emotions. And yeah, so a lot of people do not like that one, and I think it's just in part because that word is not so great. And like I say, there's a lot of overlap in that trait. It's small to medium, I think, in most of the personality differences are pretty small, but the neuroticism and agreeableness ones, I think, are the largest, most reliable ones, and they are, yeah, like I say, small to medium are the typical kind of estimates. But there's a general tendency with sex differences that, so you got your normal distributions, they're overlapping. You can have a relatively modest average difference, but then if you look at the extremes, the difference is much larger.
Mm-hmm.
So with the neuroticism one, even though the difference isn't that big in the middle where most people are, where most people, most men and most women are somewhat neurotic, but not particularly. They're somewhat prone to anxiety, somewhat prone to depression. But if you look at the extremes, many more women than men are at the extremes. And I think that probably shapes the stereotypes, is the fact that it's, dominated by women at that end. And to be fair, I'll mention another commonly documented sex difference where men come off worse would be the sex difference in aggression.
Mm-hmm.
And that one's much easier as well, I think, to tie to evolution.
Just look in the jails.
Yeah, well, exactly. But that's another example, actually. So in the jails, you find, I think, the extreme of the distribution. So
Right.
if you're looking at the more common kinds of aggression, just sort of face-to-face aggression, just being a bit kind of verbally aggressive, that kind of thing, the gap is definitely there. And so it's a medium to large gap, maybe, for face-to-face and sort of minor levels of aggression, but still quite a bit of overlap. But then at the extremes, again, you have many more men than
Yeah.
women, and that shapes our stereotypes, and that shapes who's in prison and who commits homicide and the like.
How do you think about kind of what we discussed thus far in terms of culture being able to kind of dampen down or steer biology and kind of this, I don't want to say a reemergence or this notion, the kind of the red pill philosophy. There's a movement, it seems, right now with the Andrew Tate type people. That there's a podcast I think called Fresh and Fit, and they're very much using evolutionary biology and psychology, I think probably often incorrectly, to kind of make claims about men dominating women and like the way that men are supposed to, like, because they run the
Right.
hierarchy, they're supposed to do all this. Do you ever look at any of that or see any of that out in the world and think they're getting this wrong or that wrong, or are they getting it right, or like I don't know. Do you ever put your lens on that kind of
A little bit.
group?
I haven't dug deeply into it. I have heard of Andrew Tate, and I've heard of those kind of attitudes a little bit. I don't think I knew quite that they're explicitly saying men should dominate women and things like that.
Yeah,
I
I might
do
have
think for
straw
what
manned him a little bit.
right. um, Either way, I mean, I hope you are strawmanning, because like that would be a really bad thing to be
Yeah.
saying, right? And I don't think it's true. And even if there's an innate tendency in human nature, um, like maybe just based on the basic average difference in aggression, it would just tend to be that in the absence of culture trying to push against it, it would just tend to be that in more couples, maybe the guy is going to be more dominant than the woman, than the reverse. But even if that has its roots in human nature, that doesn't mean it's right, and it doesn't mean that it should be that way.
Right.
And I think that is a mistake that people not uncommonly make when they get a kind of garbled half understanding of the evolutionary view, and they think, okay, so this isn't just an invention of culture. This is deep in our biology. This is the nature. This is how it's supposed to be, and they don't really notice. But there's a big jump between this is in our nature and this is how it's supposed to be,
Yeah, I think
and
that's
that's an
what.
unjustified jump.
Yeah, and I think that's what I guess I was trying to get at. There seems maybe it's the naturalistic fallacy, but more even than that, it seems like there's this idea that the human condition is void of culture. Like when a lot of people
Right.
talk about the human condition, they forget culture exists
Right.
and
Right.
is
Right. Yeah.
steering.
But
Yeah.
that's a important, maybe the single most important part of our culture, right? Is that
Yeah.
we're a cultural animal. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe where I part somewhere in me, maybe it's because I probably lean more left and I want to be a good person or whatnot, but the scientist in me, I don't know, but I'm just like, that seems like you're missing something if you're putting forth
Yeah.
those kind of ideas without appreciating the ability for culture to come in and steer us in a better way.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think they're missing. First of all, I think they're getting a garbled version of the science in the first place
Mm-hmm.
and exaggerating the sex differences and having a sort of cartoon version of what the past was like. And then second, they are ignoring the role of culture and the fact that actually second is the naturalistic fallacy. So second, they're thinking that the way when that whatever is natural is good, good or inevitable. And then I think the
Mm-hmm.
third thing is that is not it's certainly not good just because it's natural, but it's also not necessarily inevitable because it's natural, and that's where the culture comes in. And we do have the power to some degree at least to thwart the negative baggage that has come from human nature. We like the way I like to put it often is that genes give us a push in a certain direction, but they're not the only thing that is shaping us, and we can often push back. And sometimes it's harder than others, but sometimes it's perfectly possible. And even when it's hard, it's sometimes possible. It just takes us a while to figure out how we're going to do it. And I think the main thing I'd want to suggest to people who think that if uh, male asshole behavior has its roots in, or female equivalents had their roots in
Yeah.
natural selection and human nature. Uh, we shouldn't judge their rightness or wrongness based on whether they're natural or not natural. We should that when it comes to the ethical question, we can completely ignore that, and we should only think about just what are the effects that it's going to have on other people who are affected by it, and what is fair and what is just.
Yeah, which seems extra prudent given the fact that we are talking about the power of culture to kind of rein in the uh, well, to help the group survive. It seems the group, it puts norms in place so that we can do better, and so that seems relevant.
Yep.
Steve, man, this is my favorite subject probably, so I could
Mine too.
talk your ear off, but I want to let you get going, and I'm sure we'll hopefully talk to you again for the third book when you're ready to really get in trouble with the controversy that is likely to ensue.
It'll be fine.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to
Given
love it.
given that though, I do want to, before we go, I want to give you a chance. Like, is there anything maybe that we touched on that you want to loop back to, something you want to promote, anything, a last idea that you'd like to leave people with?
Could I promote two things? So one is my book is
Yeah.
that sort of kicked off this discussion is called The Ape That Understood the Universe. Available from probably Amazon's your best bet. Nice. Nice, you got the hardcover version. Excellent. Um, yeah, and the other thing I want to promote actually is my Substack newsletter. So that's sort of my favorite thing at the moment. The thing I'm most excited about is this newsletter. It's called the Nature Nurture Nietzsche newsletter. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but the Nature Nurture Nietzsche newsletter, and the URL is stevestewart-williams.com. It's Stewart with an EW. And other than that, I'd just like to say thanks heaps for inviting me on.
Yeah.
And it's been a really fun conversation. It's been really good.